June 6, 1944. A little after midnight, Normandy was still a place of wet fields, sleeping orchards, and the distant breath of the sea. In the hedgerows of the Cotentin, mist clung low to the ground. Along the bluffs above Omaha, concrete bunkers sweated salt and cold. The channel beyond them was black, almost featureless, as if Europe itself ended there. Then the night began to change. First came the engines, not one or two, but a gathering vibration, a pressure in the dark. It rolled over church steeples, cattle pens, flooded meadows, and barbed wire. German sentries who had spent months staring toward the water now found themselves looking up. In that darkness, before the first landing craft had even turned toward the beaches, the invasion had already begun. Not as a clean line on a map, but as a disturbance in the air, a tearing of certainty. In a few hours, another sound would join it on the shore below, the sharp metallic chime of American M1 clips flicking free after 8 rounds, a small sound, almost delicate amid artillery and surf, yet strangely unforgettable. Before the day was over, that ping would become, for many on both sides, the sound of an ocean crossing a wall. To understand why that night mattered, one has to step back across 4 years of occupation and preparation. France had fallen in 1940, and from that collapse came the central strategic question of the Western War. How would the Allies return to the continent in force? By 1944, the answer had become Operation Overlord, with its seaborne assault phase known as Neptune, a feat of planning so vast that it drew together armies, navies, air forces, meteorologists, engineers, code breakers, and dock workers into one synchronized act. Nearly 160,000 Allied troops would land on D-Day itself. More than 7,000 naval vessels, including roughly 4,000 landing craft, and 1,200 warships would support them. Around 12,000 aircraft would cover the assault, while some 23,400 airborne troops descended into Normandy by parachute and glider. Against them stood Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a defense system stretched across thousands of miles of occupied coastline. In Normandy alone, it meant mines, beach obstacles, bunkers, trenches, artillery positions, anti-tank ditches, and carefully sited killing grounds. The National WW2 Museum describes the Atlantic Wall as a 2,400-mile line armed with 6.5 million mines, thousands of concrete fortifications, and other formidable obstacles. It looked from a distance like the architecture of permanence. But walls are political objects as much as military ones. They are built not only to stop an enemy, but to reassure a regime that history can be frozen in place. D-Day mattered because it was the moment that illusion was tested. It was the day the democracies of the Atlantic tried to turn industrial abundance, coalition warfare, and moral purpose into something physical, a lodgment on the shore of occupied Europe. No German commander understood the stakes more clearly than Erwin Rommel. Sent to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, he found much of it unfinished, inconsistent, and in places more theatrical than truly impregnable. He tried to change that with urgency bordering on obsession. He demanded mines of every type: anti-personnel, anti-tank, anti-paratroop, mines for ships and landing craft, mines triggered by wires, by beams, by contact. He wanted the coast turned into a mechanized wound. He spoke of creating a 6-mile deep death barrier. And with unusual clarity, he rejected comforting theories about mobile reserves saving the day later. For Rommel, the decisive place was the shoreline itself. In April 1944, walking a French beach, he said, "The war will be won or lost on the beaches. We'll have only one chance to stop the enemy, and that's while he's in the water, struggling to get ashore. He went further. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. That was the expectation on the German side at Normandy, if the invasion came here at all. The defenders believed that steel, mines, geometry, and elevation could compensate for Germany's shrinking freedom of movement. They believed the beach obstacles, the machine gun arcs, the pre-registered artillery, and the bunkers on the bluffs would break any landing before it became a battle inland. Many also believed the decisive blow might still fall elsewhere, at Pas-de-Calais, where Allied deception had deliberately focused German attention. What they expected then was a battle of denial, a tide checked in the surf, an invasion drowned before noon, and a wall proving stronger than the democracies massing across the channel. But war has a way of punishing static certainty. The first shock came from the sky. In the early hours before dawn, the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions descended into the Cotentin Peninsula, while British airborne troops landed east of the invasion area. The U.S. Army's D-Day history notes that more than 13,000 American paratroopers were carried by 925 C-47s, with hundreds of gliders following later. The intention was precise: seize causeways, road junctions, bridges, and key ground that would protect the flanks of the seaborne landings, especially at Utah, and sow chaos behind the coastal defenses. The reality was anything but precise. Men landed in marshes, orchards, fields, and flooded lowlands. Units were scattered, equipment bundles vanished. Officers found themselves with strangers. The Army's own summary says the paratroopers were badly scattered, yet the very disorder of that drop produced a kind of violent improvisation. Germans who had expected a frontal assault from the sea found explosions, sporadic firefights, false reports, and isolated American groups appearing where no one thought they should be. In that darkness, the invasion ceased to be a clean coastal event. It became a condition. It was in the fields, at crossroads, in churchyards, in drainage ditches, in every rumor racing through telephone lines and headquarters. For German soldiers, the wall had been designed to make war linear. The paratroopers made it shapeless. Then dawn approached the coast, and with it came the test Rommel had feared most. The sea assault did not arrive against a tranquil beach. It came through rough water, heavy seas, confusion, late schedules, and the accumulated friction of the largest amphibious operation in history. At Omaha Beach, the geography itself seemed designed for slaughter. The Coast Guard Historian's Office describes rocky cliffs and sandy bluffs framing the beach, with exposed stretches of sand roughly 300 yards across at low tide, and high ground giving defenders commanding fields of fire. German positions included large bunkers, pillboxes, mortar pits, rocket sites, trenches, and some 85 machine gun nests. Men of the veteran 352nd Infantry Division were among those waiting there. The Americans who approached Omaha did not come as a single heroic silhouette. They came as seasick infantrymen, combat engineers, coxswains, tank crews, medics, naval gunners, demolition teams, wet, overloaded, and moving toward a shoreline that seemed sharper as the light improved. When the landing craft closed to within about 500 yards, German fire opened with machine guns, mortars, and heavy artillery. The Coast Guard account preserves one of the most vivid contemporary images. The water seemed to be boiling with bullets, like a mud puddle in a hailstorm. Some landing craft grounded too far out. Men stepped into deep water and drowned beneath the weight of weapons and radios. Others made it to the shingle only to flatten themselves behind tiny ridges of sand and stone while the bluffs above spat steel. Over the course of June 6th, more than 34,000 Americans came ashore at Omaha, and approximately 2,400 became casualties there, killed, wounded, or missing. From the German perspective, this was the moment the theory of the Atlantic Wall seemed briefly vindicated. On Omaha, in particular, the defenders could watch the first waves bunch, stall, and suffer. They had expected that if the enemy survived the crossing, the beach obstacles and interlocking fire would finish the work. In those early hours, that expectation was not irrational. The Americans at Omaha were pinned for hours. Tanks were lost or delayed. Engineers trying to clear lanes were cut down. Entire sectors seemed on the edge of paralysis. Coast Guard manned landing craft were torn apart under precise fire. LCI L-85 struck a mine and took at least 25 shell hits. LCI L-91 was repeatedly hit by 88mm fire, and other craft burned or sank in view of the beach. To men in the bunkers, it may have appeared that the sea itself had become an ally of concrete and wire. Yet even here, the experience diverged from the expectation in crucial ways. Naval gunfire did not cease. Air attack did not cease. Small groups of American infantry began to move laterally, then forward, exploiting folds in the ground, seawalls, shell holes, smoke, and the dead space between strong points. The official German report later admitted that the preliminary bombardment had plowed down many field defenses so that, for the most part, only the solid fortifications remained intact, and that the enemy seeped in through the gaps without trying to attack the fortifications and big strong points. That is how walls begin to fail, not always from a grand breach, but from erosion, infiltration, and the inability of fixed positions to respond to living men who refuse to remain where doctrine says they should die. On Omaha's shingle and slopes, amid the roar of naval shells and the surf dragging bodies back into the tide, another sound began to recur, the metallic ping of emptied M1 clips, tiny, sharp, almost absurdly small against the violence around it, yet it kept coming, again and again, the sound of rifles that kept firing, of ammunition that kept coming, of an army that did not disappear when the first plan broke. That sound matters because D-Day was not merely an argument of courage, it was an argument of systems. In his order of the day, Eisenhower told the expeditionary force, "You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade." He warned them that the enemy was well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened, and that the task would not be easy. But he also named the deeper fact behind the assault. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war. That was not rhetoric, it was the hidden architecture of the invasion. On Omaha, under the worst fire faced by American forces on D-Day, that superiority was present in every layer of the battle, in the landing craft that kept shuttling men forward despite losses, in the destroyers and gunboats supporting the shore, in the air umbrella overhead, in the radios, bulldozers, engineer gear, naval demolition teams, and replacement waves still coming. The German report, written in the sober language of military assessment, recognized precisely this. It spoke of the enemy's complete mastery in the air, of the flexible and well-directed support from naval artillery, and of systematic, almost scientifically conducted preparations. Within 2.5 days, the report counted 29,000 sorties in the bridgehead zone and complained that around 2,300 aircraft a day could dive bomb and strafe every movement on the ground, even a single soldier. That sentence is more than a complaint. It is an obituary for a particular German illusion that hardened coastal positions, however skillfully placed, could survive indefinitely against an enemy that fused planning, production, transport, and coalition firepower on such a scale. The ping of the M1 clip on the bluff was only a fragment of that reality, but fragments matter in memory. To a German soldier hearing it amid shell bursts and aircraft overhead, it was the intimate sound of a mass democracy that had found a way to put factories, farms, ports, and citizen soldiers into one common rhythm. Still, D-Day was never only Omaha. That is part of the emotional contrast as well. German defenders and commanders could focus on the beach immediately before them, but by the end of the day, the scale of what had happened was impossible to reduce to one local battle. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword were not isolated assaults, but connected openings in a single continental operation. The U.S. Army notes that 6 divisions landed on the first day, 3 American, 2 British, and 1 Canadian. Utah saw roughly 23,000 troops ashore with comparatively lighter losses. Gold, Juneau, and Sword brought tens of thousands more onto the coast. By nightfall, about 160,000 Allied troops had secured footholds in Normandy. Behind them lay the greatest armada in history. Above them, air power that Germany could no longer match in daylight, and beyond them, an Anglo-American logistical machine already preparing to enlarge the bridgehead. For the defenders, what had been expected as a repulse increasingly became something else, containment at best, attrition at worst, and perhaps the beginning of strategic defeat. The German report conceded the quality of Allied training and terrain adaptation. It acknowledged precise knowledge of the coast and its obstacles. This is one of the most striking features of D-Day seen from the German side, the collapse of contempt. Nazi ideology had long framed the Western democracies as soft, decadent, materialistic societies, rich perhaps, but somehow spiritually unfit for prolonged sacrifice. Normandy did not merely challenge that claim, it mocked it. The men coming ashore were not abstractions. They bled, drowned, froze, vomited, burned, and kept moving. The abundance behind them was real, but it did not make them weak. It made them sustained. Their coalition politics did not paralyze them. They brought fleets, aircraft, and divisions from multiple nations into synchronized violence on a coast chosen through years of argument, compromise, planning, and deception. The defenders had expected quantity without hardness. What they experienced was quantity married to discipline. Nowhere is that transformation clearer than in the fate of the Atlantic Wall itself. Before June 6th, it had been presented as a kind of geological fact, a fortress line, an iron coast. After June 6th, it still existed physically. Many bunkers still stood, many strong points still fought, but spiritually it had been unmasked. A wall is powerful only so long as men believe it defines the future. Once troops stand on the landward side of it, once paratroopers appear behind it, once naval shells and aircraft turn its surroundings into a cratered moonscape, it changes character. It becomes not a promise, but a relic. Rommel had understood the danger of delay. He knew reserves might never reach the decisive place if Allied air power ruled the roads. He had also understood that the invasion, if it established a large beachhead, might no longer be thrown back into the sea. On this he was tragically correct. By the end of June, according to the National WW2 Museum fact sheet, the Allies had landed more than 850,000 troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and nearly 150,000 vehicles in Normandy. Those are not mere statistics, they are the physical translation of political will. Every truck unloaded, every fuel can stacked, every artillery piece hauled inland, every ration crate and medical dressing meant that the breach was widening from event into permanence. The symbolic sound of the day, the ping on the bluff, now expanded into something larger, the clang of ramps, the grind of engines, the unloading of democracy in bulk. American abundance was not luxurious here. It was austere, practical, repetitive, almost industrial in its plainness. It was the abundance of ammunition, landing craft, spare parts, blood plasma, bulldozers, and replacement men. For German soldiers formed by a regime that glorified will while increasingly starving its armies of mobility and air cover, this was an ideological shock. They were not facing a hollow merchant civilization. They were facing a republic, and its allies that could turn prosperity into staying power. Yet the script of triumph alone would falsify the day. D-Day was a breakthrough, but it was also a wound. More than 10,300 Allied casualties were suffered on June 6th. On Omaha alone, approximately 2,400 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. The numbers vary by source and can never be made perfectly exact, but their scale is beyond dispute. Every broad claim about freedom and liberation had to pass through the intimate fact of men cut apart on wet sand, or lying in Norman fields where they had fallen, with parachutes half collapsed around them. Eisenhower understood this burden more than his public composure suggested. Alongside the order of the day, he had prepared a second message in case the invasion failed. Our landings have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. It is one of the great documents of command because it reveals what democracy asks even of its victorious generals, not theatrical infallibility, but responsibility. That too formed part of the ideological contrast of Normandy. The Nazi state demanded belief in destiny and obedience to myth. The Allied commander, on the eve of the largest invasion in history, drafted a note accepting personal blame if it failed. Between those two political cultures lay a profound difference in how power imagined itself. On the beaches, that difference was not visible in theory, it was visible in consequence. Men died under both systems, but only one of them claimed that failure, if it came, belonged at the top. As the day lengthened, and the bluffs of Omaha were finally scaled by determined groups of American infantry, the ping of the rifle clips sounded different again, not only as steel and supply, but as burden discharged one rifle at a time by citizen soldiers who had been sent there under accountable authority. For the German defenders who survived June 6th, the change in perception was often immediate and brutal. They had expected, at the very least, that the invasion could be localized, crushed, or sealed off while reserves assembled. Instead, they experienced simultaneous pressure from air, sea, and land, disrupted communications, scattered reports of paratroopers, bombardment that flattened field positions, and infantry who kept appearing where the defense was weakest rather than where doctrine wanted them strongest. The official German assessment after the landings was strikingly unsentimental. It credited Allied rehearsal, naval support, airborne skill, and exact knowledge of the terrain. Even in defeat, serious soldiers know when they have encountered a superior operational synthesis. That recognition matters because it chipped away at more than tactical confidence. It undermined ideology. Nazi propaganda had insisted that walls, race, discipline, and will could master history. Normandy suggested the opposite, that closed systems decay, that rigidity invites surprise, and that an open society with the ability to argue, plan, produce, and correct can accumulate a deeper strength than authoritarian spectacle. That is why the Atlantic Wall failed as symbol before it failed entirely as fortification. A wall built by coercion met a coalition built by consent. A regime that glorified hardness met enemies who had converted democratic industry into endurance. A structure meant to define Europe's shoreline instead announced Germany's shrinking horizon. And on Omaha, amid bodies on the shingle and smoke on the bluffs, the little metallic ping kept returning, as if history itself were tapping on concrete, reminding the defenders that another round had been chambered, another wave had landed, another republic had arrived with ammunition to spare. By evening, the sensory world of the coast had changed completely. The sea that at dawn seemed a killing ground had become a roadway. The beaches were no longer empty strips beneath hostile cliffs, but crowded military landscapes of wrecked craft, engineers, wounded men, stacked equipment, signal flags, bulldozers, and supply dumps beginning to take shape. Inland, paratroopers who had landed in confusion were consolidating the confusion they had imposed on the enemy. Roads and exits that were supposed to remain under German control were now contested or lost. The defenders who had expected a short, violent repulse had instead entered a new phase of the war, one in which the Western Allies possessed a firm foothold in France, and the initiative would grow with every tide. It was strategic, but it was also moral. D-Day changed how many Germans understood the enemy before them. The Americans were no longer distant bombers, rumor-fed industrial giants, or caricatures from propaganda posters. They were the men climbing the draws at Omaha under direct fire, the paratroopers materializing in hedgerows before dawn, the naval gunners whose shells walked up the bluffs, the riflemen whose M1s rang that metallic note again and again. And for the Allies, D-Day changed liberation from aspiration into obligation. Once ashore, there would be no symbolic victory sufficient in itself. There would only be the hard arithmetic of bocage, attrition, ruined towns, and months of further killing before the Third Reich collapsed. This too belongs in the truth of the day. Freedom did not float into France like a banner in the wind. It arrived waterlogged, seasick, terrified and bloodied. It crawled. It improvised. It lost officers, planes, tanks, radios, and friends. Then it found a way up the cliff. And so the meaning of June 6, 1944 lies not only in the fact that the Allies landed, but in what the landing revealed. It revealed that dictatorship could pour concrete, sow mines, and script triumph, but it could not stop time forever. It revealed that the Atlantic Wall, for all its bunkers and wire, was less durable than the political and industrial culture that rose against it. It revealed that abundance in the hands of a democracy could become something other than luxury. It could become the means of liberation. Not soft abundance, but disciplined abundance. Ships by the 1,000, aircraft by the 10,000, rifles by the million, ammunition clips falling empty on a captured bluff. That small sound, the ping of the M1, was never the whole of D-Day, but a symbol it endures. It was the sound of a citizen army armed in common, the sound of a home front that could keep faith with men on a foreign shore, the sound of a wall learning that it faced not a raid, not a gesture, but a people who had crossed an ocean with enough steel, fuel, food, training, and resolve to make the crossing mean something. Long after the smoke lifted from Omaha, and long after the parachutes rotted in Norman fields, the larger truth remained. Tyranny builds walls because it fears the future. Freedom builds bridges, fleets, airfields, and alliances because it intends to enter the future and survive there. On the longest day, the surf struck the sand, the bunkers fired, the paratroopers scattered, the rifle clips rang out, and a continent heard, perhaps for the first time in years, not merely the violence of war, but the sound of history turning back to liberty.